The Animas River still carries water through Colorado, but on August 5th, 2015, it turned bright orange in a matter of hours, and that single visible symptom already told you everything about a century of deferred maintenance becoming catastrophically visible all at once. What looked like a natural disaster was really a man-made blowout from an abandoned mine, and the losses spread from there. The Animas River is not healthy anymore. Some people see the Animas as a recreational treasure, a clear mountain river winding through ski country and rafting routes. Other people see it as a working river, feeding irrigation systems and municipal water supplies across the Southwest. But through a forensic lens, the Animas is not a pristine waterway. It is a delivery pipeline for a century of toxic metals, and the orange flood was simply the day that invisible pressure became impossible to ignore. We view rivers as self-cleaning systems, places where dilution and flow rinse away contaminants. But the Animas operates under a different chemistry now. One where abandoned mines leak acid and metals into the headwaters every single day, and the only question is whether that leak stays invisible or becomes a disaster. The orange plume was not the beginning of the problem. It was the moment the problem became too large to hide. Look at what happened on that August morning. An Environmental Protection Agency contractor was using a backhoe to investigate the abandoned Gold King mine, a relic from the 1800s that had been shuttered since 1923. The crew believed the water pooled behind a debris plug was only a few feet deep, a routine excavation to assess the site. But just before the breach, workers heard a hissing sound, the unmistakable signal of immense water pressure forcing its way through cracks in the rock. When the backhoe broke through, it released not a few feet of water, but a reservoir hundreds of feet deep, a pressurized column that had been building for 92 years. 3 million gallons of toxic wastewater blasted out in hours, enough volume to fill more than 4 Olympic-sized swimming pools, and it poured directly into Cement Creek, a tributary that feeds the Animas River. The irony is precise and devastating. The disaster was caused by the EPA, the very agency tasked with protecting the environment from such events. The orange color was not dye or sediment stirred from the riverbed. It was solid iron particles forming in real time as acidic mine water mixed with the oxygenated river. That orange hue is the visible signature of a specific chemical reaction, one that turns abandoned mines into generators of sulfuric acid. This is acid mine drainage, and it describes the Animas River system with terrifying precision. Acid mine drainage begins underground, in the dark shafts and tunnels where miners extracted gold and silver over a century ago. The primary mineral causing the reaction is pyrite, commonly known as fool's gold, a compound of iron and sulfur that sits stable in rock until water and oxygen reach it. Once exposed, pyrite oxidizes, combining with water to form sulfuric acid and dissolved iron. The acid then leaches other metals from surrounding rock, pulling lead, arsenic, cadmium, zinc, and copper into solution. The result is water with a pH as low as 3.0, as acidic as vinegar or tomato juice, carrying a toxic cocktail of heavy metals in concentrations thousands of times higher than what aquatic life can tolerate. In the first 9 hours after the breach, an EPA analysis estimated the spill released 880,000 pounds of metals into the Animas River. Lead concentrations at Durango, a city downstream, spiked to 3,500 times the federal standard for aquatic life. Arsenic, cadmium, and zinc followed in proportions that turned the river into a chemical pipeline. The visible plume stretched for over 100 miles, crossing from Colorado into New Mexico and onto Navajo Nation land, and it was so bright and distinct that NASA satellite imagery captured it from orbit. The orange flood was visible from space, an environmental disaster rendered legible at planetary scale. But the deeper problem is not the single blowout. It is the system that made the blowout inevitable. The Gold King mine is just one of an estimated 500,000 abandoned mines in the United States, and many of them are leaking toxic waste right now invisibly into rivers and streams across the West. These mines operate like bathtubs, filling with groundwater over decades until the pressure finds a weak spot and bursts. The Gold King had been filling for 92 years, and the pressure was compounded by a phenomenon known as the bulkhead effect. Nearby mines had been plugged years earlier in well-intentioned cleanup efforts, but those plugs simply diverted groundwater into the Gold King, increasing its internal pressure and accelerating the timeline toward failure. The breach was not an accident of bad luck. It was the logical outcome of a system where hundreds of thousands of abandoned mines sit untouched, accumulating pressure, with no funding, no legal framework, and no entity willing to take responsibility for the cleanup. Federal law makes any party that tries to fix an old mine legally liable for its pollution forever, a provision that has been called the Good Samaritan's curse. The result is paralysis. Mines continue to leak, pressure continues to build, and the only certainty is that the next blowout is already forming somewhere upstream. Now look at what happened after the orange water passed. The EPA waited nearly 24 hours before officially notifying downstream cities, a delay that drew intense national criticism and left farmers, ranchers, and municipal water managers scrambling to shut off intake valves with no clear guidance on when it would be safe to reopen them. The Navajo Nation declared a state of emergency as the plume devastated agricultural water supplies, cutting off irrigation for crops and livestock across thousands of acres. The lawsuit that followed targeted the EPA directly, and the legal and political fallout continues nearly a decade later. But the more revealing part is what happened to the river itself. The orange color faded within days as the iron particles settled out of the water column. But that visual clearing was deceptive. The metals did not disappear. They dropped to the riverbed as sediment, tons of heavy metals now embedded in the mud, where they will remain for decades, leaching slowly back into the water with every high flow event, every spring runoff, every storm. Iron acts like a sponge in the system, pulling other toxic metals down with it as it precipitates. The result is a riverbed that functions as a long-term reservoir of contamination, a chemical time bomb that will continue to release metals into the Animas for generations. After the iron settled, some river sections turned a startling green due to high concentrations of dissolved copper, a secondary visible symptom that most observers missed entirely. The disaster also forced the creation of a massive federal Superfund site covering 48 different historic mining locations around Bonita Peak, and a permanent treatment plant was built that costs millions of dollars every year to operate, filtering acid mine drainage before it can reach the river. The treatment works, but only for the mines that have been identified and plumbed into the system. Hundreds of other sources continue to leak untreated, invisible until the next pressure event makes them visible. The system also shows that fish survival was a strange and telling case study. Initial fish die-offs were lower than expected, not because the water was less toxic, but because fish could sense the pH change and flee into side streams and tributaries before the worst of the plume arrived. The river still supported aquatic life in pockets, but those pockets were shrinking, isolated, and dependent on fish being able to outrun the next toxic pulse. It is the clearest possible illustration of a river that looks functional from the surface, but operates under constant chemical stress underneath. The toxic plume eventually traveled over 300 miles to reach Lake Powell, a major reservoir on the Colorado River that supplies water to millions of people across the Southwest. By the time it arrived, dilution had reduced concentrations to levels considered safe for human consumption, but the symbolic damage was profound. A disaster in a small tributary in Colorado had reached one of the most critical water storage facilities in the American West, proof that no part of the system is truly isolated, that upstream failures cascade downstream with hydraulic inevitability. And that is the loss here. The Animas River still runs. It still looks clear most of the year. Rafters still float it, fishermen still cast into it, and tourists still photograph it winding through the San Juan Mountains. But underneath that surface clarity, the river is a delivery system for metals, a chemical pipeline held in temporary equilibrium by treatment plants and dilution, vulnerable to the next breach, the next pressure event, the next abandoned mine that finally gives way. The name Animas is Spanish for souls, and the river has long been known as the River of Lost Souls, a name that carried a grim new meaning after August 5, 2015. The orange flood was not the collapse. It was the symptom of a collapse that had been happening invisibly for a century. The moment when deferred maintenance on 500,000 abandoned mines became too large to ignore. You, the viewer, should watch for the clarity. If the Animas runs clear, that does not mean the system is healthy. It means the treatment plants are working, the dilution is holding, and the next pulse of metals has not yet arrived. Watch for the color changes, the green tint that signals copper, the rust stain that signals iron, the foam line that signals acidic conditions. Watch for intake closures, for irrigation bans, for municipal alerts that repeat with increasing frequency. Watch for the language used by water managers, the shift from temporary emergency to permanent condition, from disaster response to ongoing management. The Animas River is not dead yet, but that is the point. It is a living system operating under chemical rules that were not written by the ecosystem, rules imposed by a mining economy that extracted wealth and left the waste. The orange flood was simply the day that invisible burden became visible, the day the pressure behind the plug exceeded the strength of the rock, and 3 million gallons of vinegar-strength acid poured into a river that millions of people still rely on. The crisis is not in a river that turned orange once. The crisis is in a river that looks normal now and will never function normally again. In a system where 500,000 abandoned mines sit waiting for their own pressure event, and in a legal structure that punishes anyone who tries to intervene before the next disaster. The Animas still flows, the metals still flow with it, and the next blowout is already filling somewhere upstream, invisible, until the day it is not. Now you know what to watch the next time you see a clear mountain river, and why the color underneath the surface matters more than the color on top.